Gainsight's product experience solution helps you understand how your customers are or aren't using your product, and proactively guide them to value with personalized engagements. Gainsight tracks every login, page visit, and click that a user can take in your product, enabling you to pinpoint where users are dropping off and identify the sticky features that drive retention, making it easier for your product team to build products your customers love. To learn more, please schedule your personalized demo today.
Welcome back to the Product-Led Festival. But before we get going with the next helping of inspiring content, we'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for helping us bring this event to your screens. And don't forget, you can access even more content from exclusive articles and interviews to all past and future events on demand, as well as templates and frameworks by becoming a PLA member. Head over to theproductledalliance.com for more info. Enjoy the next session. Hi everyone, and welcome back to day 3 of the Product-Led Festival. I'm really pleased to announce our next speaker, Chris Butler, who is Assistant Vice President and Global Head of Product Operations at Cognizant. And he'll be doing a talk today on product mindset. So hi Chris, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Great to be here, and thank you everybody for taking the time to listen to me rant a little bit about the product mindset. So yeah, I think usually I happen to be the holder of the product mindset within Cognizant, and this means that I'm included on a lot of projects that are trying to in some way be more product-led, be more product-oriented, or just in general, try to embrace this product mindset that we always talk about. And so this usually starts with a question about, what is this product mindset and how do I get some? But then is almost immediately followed up with key questions like, can we do it in about 3 months? Can we do it without changing our organization? And then finally, can we do it without causing too many disruptions? And this talk is really meant to give you, I guess, a reason why you cannot actually adopt things like the product mindset without changing in some significant ways the way that people think about things. And so, generally the product manager's plan, right? If we talk about the way that most product management is done within both in-house as well as consulting organizations, it's usually we're going to start with this product mindset, and that's going to then lead us to applying our great product sense, which is something we've developed over the last years of being in the industry. We'll do some very, very smart thinking. We'll do a lot of double checking. In fact, double check everything, especially management will help us double check everything that we do. We'll then execute flawlessly. And somewhere between there and the final step is we will have a great product. And I guess I've, over the last, say, 20 years or so of experience that I've had being a product manager, I think there's not a lot of correlation between these steps A through D with this idea of profit. I think that there's some correlation, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily causation for really great product thinking and the product mindset itself. So this product mindset ends up being a really huge shift for most organizations, and I want to talk about why that is. And to start with that, one of the things we do internally is, as well as trying to bring the product mindset to client projects, we also start to train the product mindset. And one of the things that we've done to do that is to really focus in, and this is actually a video of a session that I've done internally, where we're trying to get different practices, and that could be salespeople, that could be architects, that could be engineering managers, that could even be kind of full stack engineers, to really ask why more than they are today. And from there, we then start to look at things like the 5 whys, which is where the Toyota Production System really comes in. How do we get to these root causes? How do we start to understand better why we're doing something? And then to there, we go into a case study where, in this particular case, it ends up being a banking mobile app where we're actually having them understand a certain situation and then start to get in the practice of just asking more and more of these why questions. And the reason why is a good starting point is that if we can get more people asking these questions, right, we'll get better answers. And those better answers are really trying to get at this fact that we don't know enough about the world in the way it is today, and that we may have certain assumptions about that world that are incorrect. And so why is a really good starting point, right, for this. But this will, to go a step further, I think this gets to a lot of kind of belief within the product world about how we go about this type of smart thinking. And this is something that I like to bring up and has been brought up by many different types of product thinkers, called the idea maze. So the idea maze is something from, I believe, somewhere around 2013. And it's in this paper that's titled Market Research, Wireframing, and Design. It's a really great paper that talks about a lot of interesting, important trade-offs between, for example, prototyping versus execution, and really how we're trying to gain more understanding of the world. But one of the key aspects of this, and one that is often cited, is this idea maze. And so this is actually a picture from the paper itself. And the idea maze itself is about this idea that there's a lot of decisions that we have to make from the point of view of down in the bottom left, where I've got an idea for doing music movies on the internet. And there's a bunch of different questions. Say the first question here is like, should it be open source or closed source? Should it be free or pay? Should it be subscription or per download? And each one of these decisions gets us to a different endpoint, some of which end in death. So at the bottom with Napster, but then also end up with things like Netflix, which are considered to be incredibly successful. And so this idea maze is really touted as that we need to think ahead, and we need to understand all of the product decisions for us to be able to then get to something that is very successful. The part that ends up being missed here, that a lot of people don't see when they're actually looking or thinking about the idea maze, they're trying to plan all of these different steps. When the reality is what we see is something like this, right? We see that I have an idea for doing music and movies on the internet. But if we're talking about before Netflix or YouTube or Napster existed, we wouldn't have seen all of the different steps or decision points that went through. And this is really more of a post hoc analysis of the way that these decisions were made. And this then brings me to a next step, which is that if these things are in some way cloudy, right? Like there's this idea maze is something that we want to do, but it's now balanced against something that's referred to as the deception. The deception is something that comes out of this book called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And it's a book by Kenneth Stanley and Joel Lehman, and it's one of my top 10 favorite product management books. And the reason why is it really speaks to this idea of objectives when it comes to trying to plan ahead to do something. And this is actually, it's a series of papers that were written in the field of machine learning, but I think is incredibly applicable to not only product management, but I think kind of philosophical understanding the way that the world works. And the actual cover of this book, which is this beautiful kind of butterfly picture, comes from this system that they created called PickBreeder, where PickBreeder was essentially an algorithm, a genetic algorithm to be specific, where it would generate a bunch of different images. And at first, the images started off just as black and white, kind of just ovals and circles. But through the genetic algorithm, it would continue to evolve the types of images that were created. And what was interesting is the way that evolution fitness was actually judged, which is like which groups should then breed and then create the next generation, were all dictated through this website called PickBreeder, which you can still go to. And you would see a field of a set of images, I think usually about 9, and then you would choose the one that you as a human being on that website thought was most interesting. And going from that field of pictures, right, it would then evolve over thousands and thousands of generations to pictures like these that you see here that are really interesting, like a skull or a race car or a butterfly. And what was so interesting about this was that there was no understanding of what the end goal would be of these images. And it would actually start from a place that was very kind of vague and not very good images. But the fitness of just kind of human novelty drove it to this point. And through these papers within this book, they start to talk about why that is interesting, and this idea of novelty-based search, which is a real search kind of capability, or in the machine learning world really starts to point to things like open-ended evolution, which is where Kenneth Stanley is now at OpenAI working on. And where this goes to is that if we think about something like the idea of the vacuum tube, right? Which was something that was created hundreds of, over 200, I guess 150 years ago, maybe at this point, to really handle particular things. We would have never thought about it eventually getting to be a computer, right? The people that were originally inventing these vacuum tubes did not ever imagine that a computer could exist, where vacuum tube then led to transistors, and transistors led to microcontrollers, and microcontrollers led to CPUs and full computing platforms that would then be in everybody's home and then eventually in everybody's pocket. And the reason why, again, was not because people were not smart, people were not working hard, people were not really focused on what was most important in front of them right then, but that all of this work about the computer was just not thought of yet. It was something that didn't exist. It was something that you couldn't have seen from the vacuum tube standpoint. And Stanley and Lehman actually make the case around this when it comes to evolution in general, and the work that now Stanley's doing in open-ended evolution is that from the standpoint of the very earliest bacteria on Earth, there was really no way to set up a bunch of objectives to be able to end up with a human being. And this, I think, leads us to the way that he starts to model and think about the way that we deal with the future and the way that we start to think about how we get to an objective. So the analogy here is that we're on one shore of a lake and we want to get to the other shore of the lake. We think that we have an idea of what that other shore of that lake looks like. And we need to now follow these stepping stones across the lake to be able to get to the other side. But as before, the issue is that we only see maybe one step ahead of us. And for us to be able to, we don't even know necessarily what it looks like on the other shore of the lake. And so for us, going from stone to stone ends up being almost not random, right? We're still trying to, in some way, push it towards things that we think are ideal. But the end goal, the other shore of the lake, is incredibly obscured to us, right? And what both Stanley and Lehman actually refer this as is the situation when the objective function is a false compass is called deception, which is a fundamental problem in search. And when they say search here, they mean kind of searching a possible space of an area. We can take this to understand that if we use the idea maze, right, and in comparison to the idea maze, we're trying to do a search through all of these different kind of decision space to get towards some type of end goal, which is a startup. But because we believe we know what this objective is, right, we have an idea of what the objective is right now, it will actually lead us in the wrong direction sometimes. And this is where the idea of trying to get to a finish line, you may know directionally where it is, but the way to get there may not be a straight line. And so I think this is something that is really important and interesting when we talk about product mindset. And so the fundamental problem that this product mindset that we're talking about now really addresses is one of uncertainty, right? The clouds that are not only in the idea maze, the clouds that are between the transistor and the computer, the clouds that are between the current stepping stone and the other side of the lake that we're trying to get to is uncertainty. And the uncertainty of the world is something, because we cannot see the future, because the world is not deterministic, or at least in a way that we can understand, that uncertainty will be a part of everything we do, especially when it comes to building out products that are new or interesting. And that uncertainty is something that we need to be able to embrace and actually in some way find resilience within that uncertainty. And that to me is really what the product mindset is. And so there's uncertainty in everything, right? Like if we start to take a look at a bunch of things that we do as product managers or parts of product teams, right? We can start to see things like the objective itself, or OKRs. We can start to think about the goals that we have as being somewhat uncertain, right? We have an idea of how we want to change the future, but we don't know exactly the way that we're going to do that. Our vision, right? There are plenty of times where startups have started with a particular vision, but wound up doing something completely different. Slack is a great example with games to communication methodologies. Even the idea of something like Uber, which started as a way to really hire black cars to be able to show up at your house, right, in a place like San Francisco where taxis were hard to get, to then turn into something where it's a vision about all types of transportation within a marketplace. That's very different, right? And so there's an incredible amount of uncertainty, even when we build really future-looking visions about whether it's something that will actually, in the end, be what we go after. There's also this idea of strategy, right? What are the decision models that we use to actually get forward in this world? Who our customers are, how we're trying to service them, which features or even epics will be ideal for us. the backlog that we end up creating, user stories that we end up writing, right? Will it be successful or not? This is why we end up looking at things like experimentation and prototyping. And finally, story points, right? Especially story points. This idea of how we can approximate building something brand new, but estimate the exact amount of time or effort or complexity for it is something that I think we end up getting really wrong about uncertainty. And so these are all things that tend to be components of how we do the work as a product manager or within product teams. But I think there's also just like a general understanding about the world that gets to a couple of deeper things, which is, all of our opinions are incredibly uncertain, right? It's based on our own context. It's based on our own understanding of the world. This idea of product taste and sense is something that I bristle at an awful lot because it ends up being about all of the experiences you've had or the models that you've learned and how you now apply them in the future. But those models may not be appropriate in a future sense. So, I've done a lot of work in usually technology starting to be understood. So the idea of web, the idea of mobile, the idea of AI machine learning, the idea of VR, like all these different things, we have to relearn the way that we actually interact with these objects, right? Or the way that people will use them. And so this product taste and sense ends up changing then whenever we're doing that type of bigger change. This idea of like everybody giving their 2 cents, especially, this is a great Derek Silver's article about like managers giving their 2 cents ends up actually skewing the way the team may do their work, even when that 2 cents may have been a throwaway comment. Frameworks we use, right? Like the real people that end up being real practitioners within the product management world that use lots of frameworks, they eventually end up kind of discarding them or just using the pieces that are appropriate for a particular circumstance. Methodologies, this idea of judgment, how we judge whether something is good or bad is incredibly uncertain because it's about our opinion again. Same thing with how we give feedback and what types of feedback we give to people. This idea of evaluation, and then in the end, people, right? I think if I could define what my hypothesis is for the next kind of 5 to 10 years of my life, which again is uncertain, but I would say that this idea about that most of the worst things in the world happen because of certainty around other people. And so these are all things that we should be less certain about. And there is an incredible amount of uncertainty in all of those things. And so product mindset is really about this idea of how do you embrace the uncertainty of this world? How do you build teams that are resilient with uncertainty? How do they adapt? How do they do a better job of, in general, existing within a world where there is lots of uncertainty? And so, the question you may be asking now is, what do we do about this, right? How do we actually deal with uncertainty? We can't just say suddenly that we're not going to do any planning. We can't make decisions. We can't do any of these things that are super important to us today. We can't just stop doing that, right? If we did that, probably our leadership would think that we were going crazy and that we would never get anything done. But also there is a reason why planning happens, right? There is a reason why we try to make judgment calls. There's a reason why we give feedback is because we are trying to do something better. And so what do we do about this? I think the first thing is that we need to reject this concept or this mindset of certainty, right? The embracing of the product mindset is that we will no longer say that we're 100% sure about anything. That we will no longer believe that there can be certainty about something or someone or some future. There will always be a little bit of uncertainty there. And then from there, starting with the growth mindset, right? How is it that my personal kind of belief about the world could be changed for the better? And then finally starting to burn away all of the certainty that we feel about this world, especially in the practice of product management, but when embracing the product mindset. And so, this is why in product management world, we end up seeing it taking potentially years for a product manager to be really good at what they do. I believe is very much related to this idea that we're, for the first 20 years, 22 years of our life, if you end up going to college, right, you are learning about certainties, about rules, about laws. And when you start to become a product manager, though, you need to be less certain about those things. And you need to be more adept at actually functioning in uncertainty. And so that burning away of the certainty actually is just experience being added on to your intuition. That then means that you should not be as certain about the things that are in the future. And so I think this is something that naturally happens with product managers as they start to gain understanding of the world. And to burn away this fear of uncertainty. And I think this is one of the things that really is like catches most people is that there's this kind of fear, there's this anger around uncertainty that starts to happen. And the first thing I would argue is that trying to be more curious, is a really, really good goal for most product managers, right? And for people that are embracing the product mindset. So rather than making confident statements, try to ask more questions, especially about people. And this includes not just your customers, but coworkers, everyone you know that you end up working with, right? That product mindset is really about being more curious. The second thing is to share this uncertainty between people within the same organization. And this is, I think where the more that you share stories of uncertainty, the more that people start to understand that there is such a thing. I mean, this ends up being this idea of leaders that end up being more vulnerable actually identify times that they did not know what was going on or did not end up understanding really what was happening. And that's where I think hindsight can be an amazing teacher, right? We end up saying hindsight is 2020, but I think that's really the amazing thing is that if we take it as a lesson for uncertainty, that is something that can be incredibly valuable. And then the last thing I would say is really about practicing uncertainty. And so I've referenced these IDK, I don't know cards by Von Tan, who wrote The Uncertainty Mindset, which I think is a great book. Looking at things like case studies, starting to experiment with these things called decision forcing games or cases, which are really the ability to work through an uncertainty of a situation that happened, or even the idea of using simulation within basically product team meetings to be able to explore uncertainty of the world between product managers, I think really starts to not only burn away this fear of uncertainty, get people to see more uncertainty, but also to practice how we should respond to it, right? And that I think is super important. So I've written a post about this through the Agile Insider. If you want to read it, just came out about a day or two ago, but it outlines all these things if you're interested in those resources. And thank you so much. I'd love to be able to spend a little bit of time answering questions with everybody. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope that you take away from this that you should be less certain and that we need to figure out better ways to be more uncertain about the world in the future, especially with the product mindset.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was great, really interesting. We'll move on to Q&A. So everyone, give people a minute to collect their thoughts and feel free to drop any questions in the chat box and we will go through them.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, I think that's the hardest part about a lot of this concept of uncertainty for people is that there's kind of an innate need within humanity to seek things like novelty and to actually discover new things, but also to in some way have safety of certainty. And so there's this kind of constant battle within our minds and our bodies about what we want as far as familiarity, but also novelty. And so I think that's why like the future of what we're going to be seeing going forward is how do we start to embrace this in a much more kind of deeper way as we understand the world itself. And as the world becomes more interconnected as well, it becomes less and less certain, right? The emergent behavior that starts to happen becomes harder and harder for us to actually predict in some way.
Yeah, definitely. We've got one question here from Raul, who's asked, how do you ensure you instill product mindset at scale?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And doing things at scale is one of those things, and I use scare quotes when talking about this, because I think that a lot of the time we end up trying to scale things in a way that generalizes for the most people. And this is another classic trade-off for product managers is how do we try to generalize something for as many people, but also do it in a way that is really targeted for a customer segment that we really care about or want to sell to, right? Because if we make something that's too generic, right, there's generic platforms that need to be then adapted for other people. If we do something that's too generic, most people won't buy it because it won't be the right solution for them, right? And I guess what I would argue here when we talk about scale for, say, training or becoming better at something, I would say that scale doesn't work. And the reason why scale doesn't work, right? And I have another talk about this that I call kind of making learning look more like work. And you can find this online. I have a YouTube playlist that I can post that has this as well. But the issue there is that people can't just log into these like learning management systems, watch a video, read an article, and then suddenly they're changed, right? There needs to be some amount of challenge and actual work where you're now adapting these models to your particular use case. And so I think this is why it's actually the job of every product leader within an organization to create more opportunities for these types of story sharing, feedback mechanisms, even things like playing games or simulations as a team, right? rather than this idea that we're just going to do like an online training. We're going to send you to this, if we use Udacity internally, but like, we're going to send you the Udacity course, and you're suddenly going to be like this amazing product leader. I think it's just like, it's false, right? And I think maybe that's the thing, is that this trade-off between generalization and personalization, I think, is a really hard one, because you as an individual need to be able to actually make this change for yourself. And that's why coaching is so different than just like giving talks. Coaching ends up being a lot about how am I getting you as an individual to see the change that you need to make. So I would just argue that the way you scale, maybe the way you end up scaling is that every product leader makes this part of their job. Or you end up hiring great teams like product operations teams that make it part of their incentivized job.
Great, thank you. We've got another question here from Kalpana, who's said that you have validated many of her beliefs. Obviously, this starts at the top. How do you recommend pitching this to senior leaders who most times look for certainty?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where understanding context, right? I use this a lot also when doing coaching of more junior product people, is that there's always this idea of like, I need to now convince my product leader of something because they're wrong, right? And so I think the uncertainty and the embracing of uncertainty should start with you, right? So that first rule that or recommendation around being more curious, you should understand why are they so certain about this, right? There's a real reason why they probably are certain, right? They have experiences that validate that. They've made that decision before, right? The point that you need to now, once you understand why they actually believe what they believe, it's your job then to also help them understand the way that this particular circumstance may be different, right? And this is actually related to terminology from kind of like in the mid 80s, this term dominant logic theory came out, which was that people that are very successful, they get to be to the position they are because of past mental models. The problem that they'll have is that they try to apply those past mental models to a current decision that is not appropriate. And so I would argue that every leader, should be concerned with the fact that their current mental models are wrong for the current situation. And they should be seeking out that uncertainty as well. But if they're not going to do that, it's your job to be more curious and try to understand why are they so certain of this. And then understand that nuance that could be different in this case that means that their models are not applying.
Nice, thank you. You've got another question from Marie, who's asked, how have you been most successful at moving past the feeling of failure / navigating ambiguity?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is maybe from a very personal standpoint, right? Like I've thought a lot about the roles that I've taken on at different product organizations. And I think, I've done very well in some of them and I've failed at others. And so I think taking a longer term view, and this ends up being like how we draw the system boundary of things a lot of the time, is that if we start to take a longer term view, that it's not just about this like idea of this one job that I'm doing, or even this one role within this organization, which could change over time, right? Like if you read Von Tan's like The Uncertainty Mindset, this idea of like constantly renegotiating roles over time is actually what happens, right? And so what we need to be thinking about is that we are actually a person that has goals and beliefs and desires that has more than just a career, but like a life. And from that standpoint, when you start to look at it that long of a time frame, the fact that you didn't work out in one role, or that you were not able to actually be successful at a particular thing, you then see it as like part of a story that then leads you to the next thing. And I think that to me is super important. That's why, like, again, the reason why the product mindset is all about this uncertainty is that it's not just about the fact that like you're going to ship a product and then it's done and you move on to the next product, right? The product is always in process. The product is always adapting to the uncertainty of the world, which, even if we found like product market fit, you were wildly successful, that kind of like local maxima that you found could shift out from underneath you. Right. So even if you are successful right now, you may not be successful in the future. So I think like this is where finite and infinite games also comes in, right? Like the key thing is like, how do you continue to play, not how do you win? And I think once you start to take a mindset like that, I think it opens up a lot of options that are not just the idea of being super successful in this one. So that's the way I tend to think.
Nice. Thank you. We've got time. We'll squeeze in 2 more questions. One from Lou, who said, you've led both PM and product ops teams. Would you say the mindset is equally important to both?
Yeah, I mean, I've said since we've been talking about product ops more and more that product ops is really just like PMing the PM experience. So there's always going to be this belief from leaders within a team about here's the problems that we need to solve for this product team from a product ops standpoint. And I've just found that like when you go off and you actually talk to the people, you try to understand their point of view, you're curious about the context that they actually exist within that team, you'll find that there's a slight mismatch between those things. And so I think that's true, right? Like product leaders should always be concerned that they don't really understand their own team. And they probably don't, right? They're getting filtered messages, they're getting filtered discussions. There's a lot of things that end up getting filtered away from them today because most of the time people do not exist in safe kind of work teams, right? Like most of the time. And so I would just argue that idea of kind of embracing curiosity about other people ends up being super helpful, not only as a leader of a product team, but also as a leader of a product operations team. Both of those things, curiosity is super, super valuable and important. And I think this idea of that you need to continuously do this over time, right? So even the idea of just like, you don't just like go and interview a bunch of customers and then you're done and you just build your product and that's it. Like you're constantly trying to understand how can we do a better job. And so I think that drive for that things are always a work in progress is really important. And the third thing I would just add really quickly is just this idea that we need to now also understand that the complex world that we exist within, there's no such thing as just like making a change and it's sticking. It's about lots of little tiny interventions that need to take place that could be wrong or right. And you need to experiment with those things over time.
Great, thanks. And we'll come to our final question from Ayanes, which is, are there companies who have truly embraced the way of thinking, and what stage of maturity are Cognizant at?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that maybe answering the second part of that question first is like, Cognizant is very well known for delivery and execution, and that's something that we do really well, right? We're hired by almost every Fortune 100 to Fortune 500 company probably works with Cognizant right now, or has, right? And so we're really, really well known for that. What we're not well known for is our product kind of acumen and capability. And so that's part of my job is to help change that, right? Not only from the standpoint of making it more visible, but also for us to be continuously building a better product organization. When it comes to people like teams that I think do a really good job about this, in another version of this talk that was kind of, I think Amazon is an interesting company because they're constantly able to have very large bets on things that could be tens to hundreds of millions of dollars that just fail. Right. And that failure is completely acceptable, or at least it seems like it is from the outside. Right. It doesn't always seem like people are happy always to work there. But like, so I think there's an interesting trade off here about like there are organizations, and I'd say like Apple too. Right. There have been plenty of projects that people have been building inside of Apple that have never seen the light of day. Right. And so I think this idea of being able to make really big bets as, say, an executive leader in a large organization and allow those things to fail and then to learn from them and then just like reallocate the people to another project when it fails. I think that is like a really good kind of way to think about these large organizations that actually think and do this today. But, I think honestly, the hardest thing is continuing to embrace a uncertainty mindset when you become very successful and very big. I think it's almost impossible. And so that's why you end up seeing small organizations disrupting larger organizations in very narrow kind of like fields, is because they are much more likely to learn from the current conditions and the uncertainty of the world than a larger organization, which will allow their inertia to basically carry them over a lot of problems until a problem is too big or for them to actually get away from. So that's why like I think you end up seeing catastrophic failure in some of these large organizations rather than this idea of like modification over time.
Great, thank you. And yeah, thanks for everyone for their questions. That kind of brings us to the end there. Good timing. Thanks, Chris, for your presentation today. It was really interesting. And clearly everyone enjoyed it from their questions at the end there. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. We will see you shortly on the next session. Thanks again, Chris.
All right, bye. Thank you.